see that.
Yeah, good.
All right, I think we got a good group. So Lawrence, I'll turn it over to you. Everybody's got your bio, access to the Google machine, so I won't spend any time going over your illustrious career. And I'll just turn it over to you, and then we'll just get Lawrence is going to throw out some ideas, and we'll just have a good chat, and we'll just go for 45 minutes and go from there.
All right.
Where are we finding you today? You up in the Northwest?
I am. I'm originally from Connecticut, outside of New Haven, and I spent the better part of 20 years from the mid-'90s to a few years ago in New York, and now I am in exile just south of Seattle, in a little town no one's ever heard of called Normandy Park, nestled on the Puget Sound, and it's incredible. I'm about a 10-minute drive from the SeaTac airport, but the flight paths go parallel to me, so no airplane ever goes over my house. So 10 minutes that way is the airport, 10 minutes that way is the beach. And so as somebody who sort of lives out of a suitcase, I get to leave quickly and I get to come home to nice surroundings. So yeah, it's pretty crazy. Never thought of myself as a West Coaster, but life intervenes and here I am. So yeah. Thank you for having me, Mark. I really appreciate it. I hope I do right by you over the next few minutes. You kind of what you said a few minutes ago was something I wanted to open my remarks with, which was when I mentioned to you yesterday, I was gathering my thoughts and gathering my notes. You said, something to the effect of, you could probably just come tell David Bowie stories and everybody would probably be happy. And of course, I get that. But what it really set me thinking about was that, I think for people that are familiar with David, talking about him as an innovator might be a little bit reductive or a cliche. But of course it's true, and it doesn't make the stories about him any less compelling or any less true. And I don't like to wall off those stories from people, because the thing I try to remember, and I've said it in other contexts, is the biggest David Bowie fan ever may have not been born yet. And that gets lost in fandom. People forget, and especially if you've been invested in an artist or a band or any media property, any artistic property for a long time, you take ownership of it. But I liken it to, the best scholars of Shakespeare or the most, renowned analysts of Mozart or whatever it is, are still being minted today. And so I would like to believe that the biggest David Bowie fan isn't on our radar screen yet. And so in that spirit, I think it's important that people who have worked in and around the art and in and around the artists do talk about it, because we want to make it accessible to the next generation. But I would love it to maybe to zoom out from that a little bit and level set on some of the things I wanted to talk about as it relates to creativity and technology and innovation, and my sort of thesis that those things are impossible to disentangle. Creativity is, I think of it as inspired novelty. I'm a recovering alcoholic, and a big part of the secret society that I'm in around that involves looking up words. And so there's a lot of meetings I go to where there's a dictionary keeper, and when a word comes up that we might have assumptions around, we ask the dictionary keeper to read the definition, and it's always surprising. And I can go down that rabbit hole and give you fascinating little anecdotes about that. But creativity is one that I find myself every year or so looking up again, because I forget what creativity really is. And the general definition is that it's the ability to produce new things or to generate unusual ideas. And so I think about it as an inspired novelty. The inspiration part's important, just as important as the novelty. And then innovation, I had somebody tell me as part of an executive training a long time ago that it's the practical implementation of creativity. So applied creativity And so I like to think of it as practical novelty, this sort of practical newness. Whereas maybe art doesn't have to have any other point other than aesthetic value or self-expression. Innovation's a little bit different because it has a different intention behind it. And so if we can if that's not all too controversial to say that innovation's necessarily creative, then the best innovators are not just creative minds, but artistic minds, artists, people who apply creativity for aesthetic or expressive reasons first. And I feel strongly about that because every once in a while, a really artistic, creative person comes along who jumps the track from being an artist, and they start to make impacts in other fields than their initial field, or even outside the purely artistic realms. And that's where really amazing and interesting things happen in our society, in our culture, and our development. And I think artists, they see versions of the world that the rest of us don't even really get around to imagining. And that's where I've always decided I wanted to live, that intersection of creativity, innovation, technology. And a lot of that is because I grew up in that era, right? I'm a child of the 70s. And I tell people all the food was processed, all the children were unsupervised, but somehow we made it. And the world was so wide open. And I sort of think of being of that first generation that had things like computers in the home or access to computers in school, and just how important all that was, being somebody learning about music, learning about technology, and really deciding I never wanted to have to choose between the two. Which kind of brings me to like the last definition, and this one I might read to you because it's a little wordy. And the definition is of entertainment. And I was trying to find a good definition of entertainment that resonated for me. And this one stood out to me for a lot of almost ominous reasons. It's from Wikipedia, and it says that entertainment's a form of activity that holds the attention and interest of an audience. I mean, there's so many things that could make up entertainment then. Likely to be one of the activities or events that have developed over thousands of years specifically for the purpose of keeping an audience's attention. I don't know, that it actually kept me awake for a while last night thinking about that. Just because of how valuable our attention is these days, and what a commodity it's become, and how valuable it is to companies who are monetizing our attention. And I was thinking, if I were smart enough to be a philosopher or like a theorist or a cultural critic, I would have all these thoughts about like, is our entire modern world an entertainment? But then I realized like that's just like stoner dorm room stoner talk, and so I'm going to leave that alone for now because I don't have the pedigree to dig into that too much. But it's fascinating to me that that's what entertainment is. So creativity, technological innovation, the entertainment industry, they're all in one big bucket for me, and I cannot disentangle any of that at either the macro industry level or even at the artist level. And so with all that sort of rambling preamble, I want to talk about the history of technology and art just a little bit. The first sheet music, that was really the first big distribution innovation from a technology point of view in the entertainment industry. The first sheet music was published in 1473, about 20 years after the printing press. So very early on, artists seized on technology. And what sheet music allowed to happen was that composers could then travel, not physically, but they could start to develop renown as composers. Their work could travel. Their work could be performed, interpreted, presented. And so the composer went from being a local phenomenon to a regional or national or ultimately transnational phenomenon. But it took about 350 years for us to get our first superstar, our first celebrity, from the music world, because the world moved slower from the 1400s to the 1800s, and that was Franz Liszt. And for people that don't know Liszt's story, he was the first modern superstar. People went to his concerts and fainted and shrieked and screamed. Women passed out. They fought each other to touch him. They wanted artifacts from him and totems. They tore their clothes off in front of him. And so you can replace Franz Liszt with Elvis, the Beatles, Ziggy Stardust, Justin Bieber, and it's all one and the same, right? It was this passionate fandom, where people forget that fan is short for fanatic, and it was this fanatical reaction to the art and the artist. But his innovations were only sort of secondarily technological. He was known for pushing the limits of the piano, not only as a performer and a composer, but in his technique. And pretty much everything you know about the piano now, every use of the piano, every trope on the piano, were things he developed. All the things that are really still being used today. Liszt was the piano innovator. And he died a couple of years after the first wax cylinder recordings were made. There's no known recordings of Liszt. And so he really lives on in two ways. One is his legend, and the other is his sheet music. He's distributed through sheet music. That's the only way, that's the only reason we know about him. The oral history of who he was and what he did, and the fact that we could go reproduce the sounds that he wrote down. And so that was really the state of the art, sheet music, for and even for a good half a century after the first recordings were made. They were these low fidelity wax cylinders, scratchy. You've heard them. You can go on YouTube and listen to them. It wasn't really until the 30s that vinyl records in the form of 78s took off. And while all that was happening, the next big distribution medium that emerged was radio, right, about 100 years ago. And we know we live with the fallout of radio's impact, how it changed the culture, the technology. Music played on the radio sounded better than any of the recordings you could have in your home at the time. The fidelity was better. But radio also took all these different forms of music and transported them in a way that music was never transported before. So the examples could be, country music from the Grand Ole Opry was now heard in the cities, or jazz from the Cotton Club was now heard in the suburbs. Sounds that people never would have heard before, never would have encountered, because all these places had little radio transmitters on them. Hundreds of venues around the country, performance spaces, had radio transmitters. And then the networks like NBC came around and started rolling up the transmission rights and would rebroadcast those on their network. And now you've got Duke Ellington playing to audiences across the country. Incredible, really incredible. And young people are soaking it all up, right? Like they're listening to all these sounds, and they're going to start to create new cross-pollinized forms of music like R&B, which leads to the youth movement and rock and roll. But that's all still in the future of our conversation. But radio also allowed the invention of the national and the international touring artist. So it's no longer simply sheet music that's traveling around the world and the songs themselves. It's back to being the composers and the performers. It's basically the 1400s all over again, the troubadour, the traveling minstrel who's taking their music out. And it's also where now it's not a one-off celebrity, it's the birth of the modern celebrity. Radio allowed us to have personalities who could become national and internationally renowned. And it's still a few more years until the first sort of recorded music vinyl records were viewed as a means of like artistic innovation. And it was really the concept album that was the primary innovation around recorded music. Album was a literal term. The first albums were collections of songs or collections of 78s. If you go into a junk shop and you find old 78s, they're in these bound books called albums, and they have sleeves, and the records go in there, and now you have an album. Albums were collections of songs, and that's what they became. But artists seized on the medium to innovate in the form of the concept album, and there's some very famous ones. I would want to know if anybody knows what a concept album is, or if they have any favorite ones, or if they know when the first one came out. I don't know if anybody has a preconceived notion about concept albums, but feel free to yell one at me. Does anybody know when the first one came out or what it was?
The Wall. Pink Floyd?
Close. They're off by about 35 years. You can believe it.
Oh, I was going to say The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, but it's not that then.
No, it's interesting. So some people say the first concept album was in 1946, a Frank Sinatra album called The Voice of Sinatra, The Voice of Frank Sinatra. It's the first album he made as a solo artist after he left Dorsey's band. And it's a concept album in that the moods and the atmospheres, the sounds, the lyrics, the music they were intentionally tied together. It was a collection of ballads from the 20s and 30s. And the music was sung and delivered in a very sincere style, no irony. Originally released as 478s and presented as a unified artistic package, tone, style, substance. But more interestingly, it was also the first pop album to be released as a 33 1/3 a couple of years later when that format came out. So Columbia put that album out as the first 33 1/3. It was a 10-inch, not the 12 inches that Leigh was digging out of her storage the other day. 12 inches were only for serious music. Only classical music were 12 inches back then. The pop stuff was 10-inch. We got the little stinky ones. But the first undisputably concept album was also a Sinatra record. No asterisks, no sort of revisionary history. It was called In the Wee Small Hours from 1955.
Yeah.
That's the first concept album, and that was Frank's vision. And it's basically like the hardest album you're ever going to listen to. It's all songs about depression, failed relationships, getting dumped by Ava Gardner, having your career go in the toilet. Frank wanted to make the most vulnerable record possible. And so the music's all tied together thematically. The album artwork fits, the lyrics fit, the arrangements fit, even the key signatures. So the artist using technology to realize his vision. Real innovative stuff. And, and then Frank was swept away for a while by television, the teenager, youth culture, the birth of rock and roll, all the subgenres. And then a lot of the innovation moved to the business side and business models. And a lot of the innovation moved behind the scenes for producing and presenting and delivering the music. And it's way too much to go into before we can open up for the more interactive part of the discussion. And we have to skip over things like hip hop, which is probably the most innovative thing to happen in popular music in the last 40 years in all those areas, artistically, technologically, business-wise, financially. But I want to fast forward to the internet, and I wanted to play you a video because the voiceover sounds cooler coming from the source's mouth, but I'm not going to try to mess with Google here and crash the whole thing for everybody. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me, and I'm going to read just a little bit more, and then I'll wrap up and shut up. 1999, David Bowie was being interviewed by the BBC, a guy named Jeremy Paxman. And he said, the potential of what the internet is going to do to society, both good and bad, is unimaginable. I don't think we've even seen the tip of the iceberg. I think we're actually on the cusp of something exhilarating and terrifying. And Paxman was like having none of it. And he said, it's just a tool, isn't it? And David said, no, it's an alien life form. The actual context and state of content is going to be so different to anything we envisage at the moment. The interplay between the user and the provider will be so in simpatico. It's going to crush our ideas of what mediums are all about. And it's happening across every form. That gray space in the middle is what the 21st century is going to be about. And I never really understood what David meant about the gray space, and I never actually got around to talking to him about it. But the space in the middle, it looks kind of small and almost unoccupied. They're really, what is the middle these days? There's no middle class, there's no middle ground, there's no middle place where we all meet. But if the gray meant ambiguity, then I think he was actually more right or he was right about more things than I even imagined, because the ability to deal with ambiguity is the thing I talk about in the business world as like the competitive trait. It's the thing that if you can possess, you will succeed in the 21st century. A comfort with ambiguity, an ability to thrive in ambiguity. To me, it's the defining characteristic in a successful person in this century. And so I'm going to shut up in a minute. David said all those things in that interview while he was the owner of a company called Ultrastar, which I wound up running for him, and which operated his internet service, which was called BowieNet. And we launched BowieNet in the mid-late 90s. It was initially an ISP. So you would buy a David Bowie CD and there'd be dial-up internet software on it. You'd pop it in your computer and you'd be able to create your BowieNet account. And it was so much cooler than all the AOL CDs we used to get in the mail all the time back then. I know some of you are old enough to remember the inundation of AOL CDs. They should have to pay some kind of offset for all that. But it was also a social network, even though we didn't have the language for that yet. It was a distribution hub for Bowie content and commerce and things he was selling. But it was a collaborative community where David interacted with his fans, inspired them, challenged them, and he was a member of the community. His screen name was Sailor, and he'd go in the message boards, go in the conversations. He was a content contributor. He operated the store, and it was a paid subscription site in the 1990s. It was $20 a month in $1999. Exclusive content, concert tickets, memorabilia, a real 21st century look at what a fan club could be. And the last thing I'll tell you about that was David once ran a songwriting contest on there, and he provided the demo music. So he provided a recording, him singing the sort of la la la's of the melody, and then singing the chorus. And he said, "Help me write this song." And there were tens of thousands of entries. We narrowed them down to, I think, 25 or 50, and David chose the winner. He flew the winner to New York, got the kid, and he was a kid. He was 20 years old, a $15,000 publishing contract with David's music publisher, and then put the kid in the studio, and they recorded the song. And the young man and his friend who he brought along with him from Ohio sang back up on the song. And then David put the song on his album called Hours. And if that all wasn't crazy enough, we webcast the whole thing, the rehearsals, the recording session. And, we can't find that kid now. So many of us have tried. Nobody knows where Alex Grant from Ohio went. It's too common of a name, and he doesn't seem to have made his mark in any other field. But those were the things David was doing as an artist and as an innovator and as somebody who could take technology and do things with it that we're still catching up to now. He let fans design merch, vote on which ones we should make. He even had a 3D metaverse on the site in 1999. It was called Bowie World, and it was an open world. You create an avatar, you could dress it up, you could walk around, you could chat with people in 1999. And, there's all kinds of stories from BowieNet and ultimately the Ultrastar business where we provided these platforms for innovation to other superstars, the Stones, the Chili Peppers, Mariah Carey, other artists who we said, here's a tool set. What would you do with it? How would you interact with your fans? And though it was the same platform, every one of those communities was different because the artists did different things with them and the artists' fans were different people. And so the most important, interesting to me was that this one man, an artist, could apply his creativity, could innovate in all these realms: music, fashion, art, technology, like even philosophy, human relations. And he did that thing in big ways and small ways over and over and over again. And that even now, those of us who are working on projects for him in his absence, he left such a high bar. And he told us to never create new interpretations on his behalf. So we don't define the art, we don't explain it to people, we just present it and make it available and put it on platforms where other people can interpret it and remix it and reuse it and reapply it, because that was what he was most interested in. I've created this thing, but I want to see what other creative people will do with it and innovate with it. And you see things even now where people can mash up his music, can remix it, can sample it, can slice and dice it. I don't know if any of you have seen the new film, the documentary, and how his music and art was used there. That's what David wants people to do. And so it's all fascinating stuff. And thank you for letting me talk at you. I hope there's a conversation we can have now.
Well, that was great. Yeah, if anybody has a question, you can just pop in and ask away. Lawrence, I want to ask you, you actually are being pretty modest with your technology. You were one of the first e-commerce bookstores in Connecticut, which I was quite interested in.
I can't believe you found that.
And growing up around Yale, you had access to their terminals and stuff, and also some of the stuff you guys are doing with Ultranet. It's interesting, like with tech, or just your experience. Like, is it good just to get out there, try stuff, even before the market's even there? Some of the stuff was leading edge, and dragging customers to where the world is going always seems to be a challenge for creative types, especially around technology.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's interesting because, so I studied computer science for a few years. I didn't finish my degree, but I was always aware of technology. Like I said, even as a kid, I grew up sort of technology enabled and technology interested. And so I was in a car accident, got a small settlement, and did the smartest and dumbest thing in the world, which was I opened a bookstore. This was the early 90s. I had a direct mail catalog. I tell people now, that's something you do at the end of your career, not at the beginning. But it was incredible. It was the equivalent of my MBA. I spent about as much money and I learned about as much. But I didn't have the vision. Like Bezos said, let's take a database and make every book in the world available. I said, let's take the mail order catalog and get leads to mail out the catalog. And so I literally had one of the first .com websites, and it all amounts to a big shrug, because my idea was, well, I'll put the lead generation form online and people will request catalogs and I'll mail them out to them. That was my big vision, but it worked. I started getting money orders from around the world, Israel, Japan, and I was an international business guy. It was great, but I don't know if I'm answering your question. So the question was it around experimentation or what?
Yeah, just like the idea of like with tech and like even the stuff, with BowieNet and, some of that stuff's so cutting edge, but like the audience wasn't ready yet, and I think there's a balance between being so creative or so forward leading and trying stuff, but how do you, get customers to actually embrace it? And so I have this idea, like sometimes it's better to be like the first second, right? Like there's a lot of dead pioneers on the plains, like, let somebody else go out there and kind of blaze a trail, and being the first second sometimes is a more successful business model.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people who would say if you scratch the surface of some of the innovators or celebrities or artistic heroes we have, you'd find that they weren't necessarily the first. They were the first popularizer, but they weren't necessarily the first. They were able to take the thing and magnify it and mainstream it or blow it up. So I don't necessarily have a theory around that, except to say that does seem to be true. But in terms of what was ready and what wasn't ready, the technology definitely wasn't ready. David had us doing things that we should not have been doing yet because they weren't good user experiences. He sold the first download through an artist website in like 1997. I don't even remember now, but it must have taken hours to download the 4-minute song. We did video chats with him and Iman out of the office in 2000, and we probably used real media. The highway's littered with these dead technologies. So the technology wasn't ready, but it attracted the audience and it built his brand. It reinvigorated him. The thing that people forget is David was never very big in America commercially. He had the initial hit in the early 70s, and then he was always an interesting artist. And he would flirt with being able to play arenas, but then he'd go back down to theaters. It wasn't really till Let's Dance that he blew up globally and blew up in a mainstream way in America. And then he spent the rest of his career never being at that level. Outside of America, he could play arenas and stadiums. Globally, he's a massive, massive superstar. in America, he's more renowned and respected than he ever was commercially successful. It's fascinating when you really dig into his business. But yeah, I don't think anybody was ready. It took the artistic mind to bring these things to market in novel ways. Otherwise, like, real media was going to be like used for earnings calls. Things like that.
Hey, Leah, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. So this whole topic is fascinating to me. So I'm really interested in fandoms, and especially how they've evolved now, where the artist is really not as involved. It's the fandoms that are creating on their own all of these memes and merch and experiences. And I'm shocked that more artists aren't engaging with their fandoms in meaningful ways. I know there's some, I can't remember if it's Doja Cat, who have actually created an advisory board of fans. So she'll go to them and say, hey, I'm working on this song. Can you give me some feedback? Very much in the way that you were describing kind of the songwriting contest. But that is the rare example. And so as you were describing BowieNet, I was like, this is so incredibly visionary. And still to this day, I don't see a lot of musical artists interacting in a way that could be incredibly productive for them. And not only kind of energizing the fan base, but also paying fans for all the work that they're doing currently for free, to have some kind of monetization there. But then also the implication of fandoms for business in terms of loyalty programs and membership and all, you know, and on and on and on. And so I guess, why do you think, you know, Mark, you mentioned that the technology was kind of ahead of its time and that the audience wasn't there yet. But in a way, also it feels like to me the artists weren't there yet, because you had this model in the early 90s that still isn't being, I mean, still we have a very traditional kind of experience of like, these are rock stars and I can't access them, and, you know, all of this. Why do you think, and the same with business, you know, their focus is on acquisition. It's not on kind of fandom.
Yeah.
What do you think is the barrier, and do you know of anyone that's doing anything interesting today in this space?
Yeah, I want to try to give you a concise answer. I think about this topic a lot. I've thought about it a lot over the years. Part of it was unique to David and where he was in his life. You know, he stopped being so persona driven and became sort of an authentic version of David Bowie in the last sort of third of his life, or public life, certainly the last 10 or 15 years of his life overall, 20 years even. From the mid 90s on, he became a much more genuine character, the elder statesman Bowie. And he got off the road for a while. Even before he did his last tour, he settled down with Iman. He settled down in New York. He had a child. And so I think there was some, again, this is me interpreting. This is not something from the canon of David Bowie, but my impression was that it was good for his lifestyle to, like, this was something he could do that didn't require him to be away from his family for 2 years at a time. He could be creative. He could explore. Like, who are these people? I think he was genuinely curious. He was also the largest collector of David Bowie memorabilia on the planet. David employed somebody to buy and sell stuff on eBay. So he basically had one or two of everything. And he was very into like folk art, fan art, bootlegs, you know, illicitly made goods. He liked what people did with Bowie. And so part of it was him. But other artists have done other things. I think that there's a novelty factor, because in fairness, even David after a while kind of drifted away from it, because they're constant, you know, very few artists want to do what everybody else has already done. And so it has to continue to be novel. And I personally, this is just me ranting, but I think as the business part of the industry, we failed artists in that regard. the two currents that came together were social media was a hoodwink on the artists, right? Drive your fans to these other platforms because will help you reach more people there. And then guess what? Now we're going to charge you to reach them. That was so alluring to artists. Oh, I don't have to be dedicated to this website that I have to feed day in, day out. I don't need another job. Like, I just want to go on vacation. So the social media networks were alluring, but they hoodwinked the artists, in my opinion. And the competing strand was, I think we didn't continue to bring them wholly owned platforms, the ability to do the next version of BoneNet. So are there other artists doing things? I mean, I look at a band like BTS. Yeah, they're very distant maybe from their fans, but they go right up to the glass. You know, I watched some of their webcasts. Like, if I understood it instantly, right? Like, it resonated with me. I was like, this is fun. If I were in this demographic, I would think this is the coolest thing ever. But you're still not really interacting with them.
Yeah. One thing that I've found that I love to do is I've kind of rediscovered my joy of being in a fandom and being a fan. And I recently became obsessed with Haim, which is this three-sister band. And so I just kind of interact with the fandom on Twitter, who are basically all teenage girls. I don't know if they realize that I'm like a Gen Xer or whatever. But it's really fascinating because they have their own language and a different, their own like mythologies around each member of the band and different kind of story. And it's really fascinating to see an artist through the lens of the fan versus, kind of, I don't know, how the artist kind of presents themselves, because it's not as interesting, to be honest, as the way the fans think about it. At this point. I feel like from a marketing and branding perspective, it's completely flopped or flipped.
The last thing I would say on that point before I shut up for other people is that I do use the one-liner a lot, that fan is short for fanatic. And I think a lot of artists learn that the hard way. Like, there were definitely, David was thick-skinned and he could mix it up with the fans, but there's a lot of sense of ownership, and fans bring a lot of emotional connection to those relationships, and you have to think about that intensity when you're on the receiving end of that, even if it's mediated by a screen and a phone line. Like, it's pretty heavy. Yeah. People think they know you. And now you're connected in some way. They're leaving you messages. They're asking you for help. They're threatening to kill themselves. They're telling you when their mom died, when their dog died, when they're having a great day. It's a lot. And so I think a lot of artists are potentially rightly afraid to open that spigot because it's hard to turn it back off, because now you've abandoned the community.
Right. That's a great point.
Hey, Joe, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just listening to what you were saying there. I had breakfast when Mark Thompson was still the chief executive at the New York Times, and I have a very, very small TV show. And he said, "Have you become famous?" And I said, "Well, I tend to wear a shirt with a collar when I travel on aeroplanes." And he said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, because somebody always asks you for a selfie." And he said, "Do you get much else?" I said, "Well, to be honest, no, I never ever see anybody other time." He said, "Look, I've made a lot of people very famous." And he said, every one of them would say they want to go back to that as the optimal level of fame, which is you get asked occasionally for a selfie in an airport. And that is because after that, it does become overwhelming. But no, the reason I put my hand up was, you said the thing about attention. I mean, this is how I think it is. Attention's become, and in this attention economy, it's become disconnected from a sort of human editorial process. An algorithm doesn't care whether it's getting your attention because this is something good or fun or interesting or anything like that. It just wants your attention. So it just gets you back on, and it can be hate scrolling, it can be all sorts of things. David Bowie, when he was talking about the sort of future, that almost the potential of a dystopian future, I don't know, maybe he foresaw that when you get just an AI that's working out what goes out of the 20,000 posts, what goes into the top end of your feed, he's not thinking like an editor is and saying, or you know, he's not thinking. There's no creative person in there. It's just what will make you watch for the next 20 seconds, next 20 minutes.
I'll give you a very practical anecdote around that. We used to have, David wanted this system on the site called Karma, and you would get points for participating. And there was a Karma board on the site, and it was basically a leaderboard, and the people who participated the most would show up higher on the board. Well, it was exactly what you just said. It had no qualitative input. It was simply, I post a lot, I comment a lot, I click the like button a lot, whatever the metaphor was back then. And so you can only imagine the shitstorms that people were encouraged to stir up. And, you know, David he would never let us censor. We were never allowed to censor anything on the site. And so people would just learn to stay away from the Karma board area because it was, I think maybe he thought it was funny or just didn't care after a while. Or it was some kind of experiment in seeing what humanity would do. But it was exactly that. It was just attention. Me. Look. I'm saying naughty things, and it's making making people furious, and it's making me go up the board. We had to call a member one time. His screen name was Alexander, and I forget what it was now. He was raising hell on the message boards, and at one point, David said to him, "Don't go away angry, just go away." And I think even now, like, man, to have the rock gods just frown upon you that way, it must have been the worst thing. But we were going to call him. We were going to be like, dude, like, who are you? And like, why are you doing this? Why do you pay money to come here to do this? And we called him, and his mom answered the phone. And the whole time we were thinking we were calling, a normal adult. And we weren't. We were calling a grown person who was obsessed with the internet and obsessed with attention and probably lived in I don't even know what the profile was, but it wasn't, it wasn't happy.
No.
So. In fact, the young man who won the songwriting contest, you can Google there's a bunch of stuff on YouTube because it was covered on, used to be called ZDNet. Ziff Davis had a little like internet TV channel, and they covered this whole thing, and they interviewed the kid who won the songwriting contest. The song is about the good and bad of the internet. It's probably why David chose the lyrics. And they interviewed the kid, and he said, this is 1999. He said, I got on the internet 3 years ago. I didn't know anything about it. And it basically devoured my whole life. Like, I was on the internet constantly, and I realized it wasn't a good thing for me. And that's what this song is about. And that was 1999. Wow.
All right, Carla, you got to bring us up with a good question. We got to close out strong with some positivity here.
Well,
tell us the internet is good.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. That's super interesting stuff. I kind of want to ask what might be a bit of a heavy question. Pretty dark, actually. So I came to Bowie quite late, although I'm just about the right age, maybe a bit young, 54. So I am actually an enormous fan of Black Star, and it's interesting what you were saying about him being himself. I'm not one of these people that can remember lyrics, but I love that first verse in Lazarus where he says, I've got drama, can't be stolen, everyone knows me now. Which seems to me to be kind of that I'm going out now and look, this is the real deal. But the reason, I want to ask you what may be an inappropriate question, because I've got what I regard as the real luxury. I'm actually a property developer, and I'm currently just about finishing the development of part of the mental hospital where his brother Terry lived and then sadly committed suicide just down the road. And it's actually the building that is the cover of the English version of The Man Who Sold the World. So that actual building you can see behind the character with the rolled up poster. And I wondered whether it's sort of appropriate to ask you whether you ever talked about madness with him and the sort of the dance with madness. I don't know a whole lot about Bowie, but I know that his relationship with his brother was difficult later. He didn't talk about it. And I believe I'm right in saying he always had a real fear of madness himself. Is that something that ever came up in your conversations?
No. no, it's probably on the long list of things that I wish. The conversations, such as they were ever only about the matter at hand or music. We had a thing in the office where like we would try to stump them with music, and it was shockingly difficult. As you might imagine, like when you scratch the surface on a lot of these artists, like they know everything about music. It's actually maddening. I think they know everything. It's like, how the hell you did all that and you know about all this? Like, Jesus Christ. So no, I'm sorry to let you down there, but I would say he definitely left a record of talking about it, oftentimes contradictory. He was definitely capable of completely contradicting himself. But I think that was less about being deceitful and more about thinking out loud and evolving his views on things over time and just always putting himself out there. But no, I mean, so no, I don't know what his true personal thoughts and feelings were on that topic.
I hope it wasn't too personal a question. It's interesting though what you just said, if I may come back, because you talked really eloquently. I wrote it down actually. I thought it was beautiful, the ability to deal with ambiguity and thrive in it, to be a defining characteristic of the world we're in. And I would argue, such as I know about the guy, that he lived that ambiguity brilliantly. I mean, I remember when I was a young kid, my mum, as you can imagine, who's 84, throwing her head in the air, the first time he was on top of the pop saying, what on earth is this? Is it a man? Is it a woman? And as someone who kind of grew up into I got really into music at the back end of the 70s, early 80s. For me in London, it was probably, I wasn't into that scene, but it was probably the Blitz Club and all the new romantics. And, to them, Boy George, all the Spandau Ballet guys, Bowie was the hero that allowed them to be whatever they wanted to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that, I think it just seems to me to be an enormous legacy to leave, to actually allow future generations, probably forever, to be whatever they want to be with a degree of comfort. I know there were others, but he was the king, right?
If there was a theme on BowieNet, it was that. You could go on the message board. You can go to davidbowie.com now, and all the same people are still in there. It's just not BowieNet anymore. And that is the governing theme, is that David made the world safe for them and made it possible for them to be who and what they are. And that's everybody from disabled people, queer people, different thinking people, different looking people. Like, it didn't matter the specifics of the situation. Any kind of perceived difference or perceived otherness, he definitely gave those people, at the very least, comfort, if not like outright permission and emboldenedness. For sure, you're 100% right on that.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was great, Lawrence. Thank you so much, Lawrence Peryer, for spending time with us. That was great. Lawrence has a great podcast called Spotlight On. I think you're well over 100 episodes now with interesting people from music, entertainment, the business side of it, and really been at the forefront of creativity and technology. And I really, what you said about using technology to advance creativity, I thought was really positive. Can we share your email address with the group here? If they want to reach out and follow up.
Yeah, it's very, it's LPERYER, @gmail.com.
Perfect.
Or if you want to go old school, I might still have lperyer@davidbowie.com. You could try it, and I'll tell you if it works or not. I may have maintained that address.
What a glorious time! The early
that you guys chose to invite me to this forum. I really appreciate it.
Great.
It's incredible. Thank you.
No, Lawrence, I really appreciate that you took the time, and I mean, there's so much more we could talk about. Even Kiss, ABBA records. I don't know. For me, I've really been battling between listening to all this great music from the 80s. I read this thing like Lorne Michaels was saying, we all think our best entertainment's from high school, and I'm still listening to U2 songs out for like nearly 40 years, but then trying to, force yourself to go out there and find new music. I don't know. It's a real battle, but I appreciate all the work you're doing and bringing all this great music to us and entertainment.
Thank you. Yeah, people ask me what my favorite new band is, and when I answer, I realize, oh, that band's like 25 years old now.
Exactly.
Like I can't say Wilco is my favorite new band.
I just discovered this band called Big Wreck, and they're this like Boston, Montreal band, but they were formed in like the early '90s, and I was like, oh, I found this new band, but yeah, no, actually, they're quite old.
Yeah. That's a whole nother conversation. I'd love to have someday around the lack of context now. That's really fascinating, especially working with younger people in media and entertainment. You listen to the playlists that a 25-year-old makes now, and there's no differentiation between high and low brow. There's no irony. It's like they'll put Susu Studio right next to like a hard gangster rap song and a Fleetwood Mac song and some kind of weird psychedelic indie band. It's fascinating. I think it's great. It's amazing. I'm happy that world exists, but it's fascinating.
And then I read this stat today. Hip hop is going to celebrate 50 years in 2023, which is
crazy.
Which is hard to believe, but
I think you need to get us all together for a week, Mark. You need a Brigadoon conference or something. We need more of this. We need to be all in.
Great stuff.
Do it in Detroit in some shitty old industrial unit that's knackered. That
we could do it at Third Man Records in Detroit, right?
Come on.
Oh yeah, you got to bring a stack of vinyl to attend. That'll be the requirement.
I'll put my deposit down.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Well, thanks everybody. Lawrence, this was great. Thanks everybody. Good to see everybody.
Thank
you. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Ciao.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Eric, see you, buddy.
See you, man. Good job.
Hold on. I'm going to stop recording.